We're almost done. Time to add the rest of the recipe feature set here to the NGRX world. And for that, why don't we start by making sure that we can also edit and delete recipes. Thus far, that still happens in the recipes service. Here we have add and update and delete recipe. And these three things now should also be handled with NGRX. So let's go to the recipe actions. Let's export some new identifiers here. Add recipe, where our string is add recipe. Then also update recipe here, and also delete recipe, like this. These are the identifiers. Now, of course, we need the classes that meet them. So we have add recipe, which implements action, and there the read-only type will be add recipe, of course. Now there we also need a constructor with a payload, because obviously when we add a recipe, we need to know which recipe to add. And if we have a look at the recipe service, we see that we expect a recipe here. So let's do the same in our action. We just assume that the payload is the recipe that should be added. We also have our update recipe class that implements action. And there the read-only type is update recipe. And now, just as before, here we also need a constructor. Let's check the recipe service. There we expected the index of the recipe to be updated and the new recipe. Let's expect the same here on this action. So our public payload here would be an object with the index, which is a number, and with the new recipe, which is a recipe. And we also, of course, have our delete recipe action, which implements action. And there we also have the read-only type set to delete recipe. And we also need some data here, because for deleting, we also need to know which recipe to delete. And therefore, our payload is just a number, the index of the recipe that should be deleted. And that, again, is in line with the recipe service, where we also get that index. Now let's add all these newly added classes to that union type. We can also add fetch recipes there, and then it's add recipe, update recipe, and delete recipe, like that. This is now all added here to the actions. The next step is to work on the reducer. Because all these actions we just added result in synchronous state updates. None of those actions requires us to send a HTTP request or perform any side effect. And therefore, we can simply add a couple of new cases here in our reducer, for example, for adding a recipe. In there, we'll return a new state, which is based on the old state, and where we basically have an updated list of recipes, which is our old list of recipes plus the new recipe. We can easily add this by first of all copying all the old recipes and then simply adding action payload as a new element, because the payload for add recipe, so for this action here, is just the recipe that should be added. So that's the first new thing we added, the first new case. Now let's of course also handle the case that we update a recipe. In this scenario here, we first of all have to find the recipe we want to update, then copy it, then change it, then copy the list of recipes, and then replace the updated recipe in that copied list with the updated recipe, and then use that copied and changed list as a new list of recipes. So here, first of all, we copy the old state, and then we need to do all the things I just described, which sounds more complicated than it is. Let's first of all fetch the updated recipe by reaching out to our state recipes, and there we use the action payload index to get the recipe with the index we want to change. Now, of course, that would just be a pointer at the original object. So let's wrap this in curly braces instead and use the spread operator to pull out all the properties of that recipe. So now we created a copy of that old recipe. And thereafter, let me split this into 2 lines. Thereafter, I want to override some properties. And basically, I want to use my action payload new recipe. And with the spread operator, I extract all the properties from that new recipe and basically merge them into this object, which is my copy of the old recipe. Hence, this will override all the values of the old recipe with the updated values. So that's the updated recipe. Now we just need the updated recipes, so the entire list. For that, I first of all copy my old recipe list so that we have a new list. And then on the updated recipes, let's select the right recipe through the index here and set this equal to the updated recipe to override that element at this index in the copied list. And now we can use that copied list down there, updated recipes like that. Now last but not least, the delete case. For that, we have recipes actions delete recipe. We also return a new state object here where I copy my old state. And then recipes here will be my old recipes, but without the recipe I want to remove. We can easily do that by referring to state recipes filter. Filter will always return a new list, so we don't mutate the old list. And filter takes a function which gives us access to each element and the index of that element. And the index is important for us because we want to return index not equal to action payload. Now why? Because the action payload here is the index of the element we want to remove. And if that's not equal to the index we're currently looking at, and this function runs for every element in the recipes list, if these do not match, then we're not looking at the element with the index we want to remove. Therefore, we will return true here, and that means we keep it. Only if these do match, then we return false, thanks to our not equal comparison, and then we will remove the matching element. That's the reducer. These are the actions. The missing thing, of course, is to dispatch these actions. For that, let's go to the recipe edit component, and in there, on submit, we emit update and add recipe. Let's no longer use the recipe service for that, but the store instead to dispatch a new recipes action. And for that, we need to import these actions first. So import as recipes actions from store recipes actions. And with that imported, here I can use recipes actions. And here we're editing an action, hence I want to dispatch a new update recipe action. And this requires this ID, which is the index of the to be updated recipe. Whoops, wrapped in an object though. So we set index equal to this ID, and we set the new recipe equal to this recipe form value. So now we're dispatching the update action. Let's do the same for adding a recipe. For this, I'll dispatch a new recipes action add, whoops, not this, add recipe like that. And here we now need to forward this recipe form value. Let's also make sure we can delete recipes. That happens in the recipe detail component. There we have on delete recipe. I no longer will use the recipe service for that. Instead, we use the store dispatch a new recipes action. For that, again, we need to import everything as recipes actions from this store folder, and there from the recipe actions file. And with that imported, here we also use recipes actions delete recipe, dispatch this, and of course add the information which index which index the recipe has we want to remove. And with all of that added, let's reload our application and let's give this a try. Let's edit this, change the title. Now the change title is not reflected because if we inspect Redux again, what happens is that we do call update recipe here, and indeed, if we have a look at the differences, we see that one recipe was changed and got the new title, But thereafter, we navigated, and that kicked off the resolver again, which simply loaded new recipes from the server, and that overrides our change here. To fix that, we can go back to our resolver, and in here, we simply select our recipes from the store and add pipe. Now, first of all, I add a map operator here, which is imported from RxJS operators, of course. And here we get our recipes state, and I return recipes state recipes. This now either is an empty array if we haven't fetched any recipes yet, or it is a filled array. And therefore, in the next operator I add to this observable chain here, I'll add switch map, where I get my recipes. And now if recipes length is equal to 0, then I know I have no recipes. In this case, I'll dispatch this. And in this case, I'll return this observable with its own pipe. Otherwise, we still need to return an observable, but otherwise I just return auth using the auth operator imported from RxJS. And I simply return my recipes in here. So this means I don't send any request if we already have recipes. Now this overall observable here is returned. Now I also, first of all, want to add take one here to ensure we don't do this multiple times. With that, if we reload here, our data is fetched. And now if I edit this, this also persists, because now we're not refetching data, because I already do have data in my storage. Now let's also test the other things. Deleting. Here we get an error, cannot read property name of undefined in the recipe edit component. This error occurs if I go into edit mode, and then I cancel, and then I delete this recipe. Reason for that is that in the recipe edit component here, I never clean up my subscription for selecting data from the store. And we should do that here. So let's add a private store sub, which is of type subscription, which needs to be imported from RxJS. Like this. And now let's go to the place where we set up this subscription, which is here. Like this. And an ng onDestroy, which I now also want to add, and hence we should add the onDestroy interface here and implement this, imported from @AngularCore. Now we add ng onDestroy, maybe here. And in there, I call this store sub unsubscribe. And if we do that, and I now fetch data again, if I go into edit mode, and then I cancel, and then I delete, now this works, because now we don't have any old subscription that tries to fetch data which isn't there anymore. Now in the recipe detail page, we don't need to do that. So if I delete here without editing first, we get no error, because in the recipe detail page, we set this subscription up as part of our route parents subscription, and there Angular takes responsibility for us and unsubscribes for us. And hence we don't have any ongoing old subscription here. Let me reload and fetch again. Let's now also try adding a new recipe. Test. Some image. This is a test. And add an ingredient like buns 1. Save this. And here we also get an error. Cannot read property unsubscribe of undefined. Now the problem here is, stemming from that unsubscribe we just added, in the recipe edit page, if we never were in edit mode, in init form here, then we never set up this subscription, and hence when we try to unsubscribe, we fail. So we should check if this store sub even exists, and we can only unsubscribe if it does. So that's an improvement we have to make here. And with that, let's try creating a new recipe again. test, add an ingredient, buns 1, and hit save. And now this looks way better, and we can view it here as well. We can fetch our data, which will overwrite that existing ingredient, but that all looks pretty good now. So these core mechanisms now all seem to work.